She was worth $3 billion, photographed at every gala, wanted by every man in every room she entered. And on a Friday night in Silver Ridge, Colorado, she was sitting completely alone at a candlelit table, staring at a phone screen, watching her dignity quietly collapse one unanswered message at a time. The second wine glass was still full. The second menu hadn't been touched, and the man who was supposed to be there was already 23 minutes gone. What happened next? When a tired, ordinary man in work boots looked back through a restaurant door, would unravel a secret that a brilliant, guarded woman had been carrying in silence for years. If stories like this one move something in you, the kind that remind you love doesn't arrive on schedule, and the people who deserve it most are often the ones who stopped looking, then you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel and stay with us until the very last word, because we tell the stories most people are afraid to say out loud. Hit that like button and drop a comment right now telling us the city and country where you're watching. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's worth every minute. The shift ended at 5:40. Evan Calder knew this not because he checked his watch, but because the overhead fluorescents in the maintenance bay flickered twice the way they always did when Kenny from the evening crew hit the main breaker on his way in. It was the kind of detail that only registered after years in the same building, the same rhythm, the same smell of machine oil and old pipe insulation that had worked itself permanently into the fabric of Evan's jacket. He peeled off his work gloves, stuffed them in the side pocket of his bag, and stood at his locker for a moment longer than necessary. Fridays used to mean something different. He couldn't remember exactly when they had stopped. Mia was at her grandmother's for the night. Carol had called that afternoon, her voice doing the particular thing it did when she was trying to sound casual and failing, to say she'd love to have her granddaughter for a sleepover, maybe rent a movie, make popcorn the old-fashioned way on the stove. Evan had said yes immediately, partly because Mia loved those nights, and partly because he could hear in his mother-in-law's voice that she needed it too. 8 years since Claire had died, and Carol still sometimes called on Friday evenings just to have something to hold on to. So the apartment would be quiet tonight. Evan drove into town without any particular plan, which was unusual for him. He was a man who made plans. Grocery lists written in the same order as the store aisles, maintenance schedules color-coded by urgency, Mia's school pickups mapped against traffic patterns. Structure was how he'd survived the years after Claire. You couldn't fall apart if you were already busy. But tonight the apartment was empty and his stomach was making decisions his brain hadn't caught up to yet, so he pulled into the small parking lot beside Caruso's, which was the kind of Italian place that had been on the same corner for 22 years and still printed its menus on laminated cardstock. The Friday crowd had already packed the place. He pushed through the door, felt the wave of garlic and warm bread, and the particular loud hum of a room full of people who were glad the work week was over, and made his way toward the takeout counter near the back. A woman in a red apron he didn't recognize was managing the pickup orders with the frantic efficiency of someone who had been doing this since noon and was running purely on muscle memory. "Name?" she said without looking up. "Haven't ordered yet. Just going to call it in if that's..." "Menus on the wall. Cash or card when you pick up." He took his phone out and found a spot near the hostess stand to look up the number, which was when he stopped moving. Not because of anything dramatic. He just noticed her. She was seated near the window, at one of the smaller tables with the better candlelight, the kind that Caruso's reserved for date nights and anniversaries. She wore a dark blazer over a simple top, her dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless but probably wasn't. In front of her were 2 menus, 2 water glasses, one of which had been touched and one of which hadn't, and an empty chair directly across from her. She was looking at her phone, not scrolling, just holding it, reading something on the screen, in the particular still way people go when the thing they've just read is worse than they expected. Evan looked away. He ordered his food, linguine with clams, a side of the bread that Mia always wanted him to bring home, even when she wasn't there to eat it, and found a spot along the wall to wait. The restaurant moved around him, plates sliding past, glasses clinking, a kid 2 tables over refusing to eat his pasta in a way that made the parents look like hostage negotiators. Normal Friday sounds. He looked back at the woman by the window. She had put the phone face down on the table. That small gesture, the way you flip a phone over when you don't want to look at the screen anymore, but also can't make yourself put it away entirely, made something in Evan's chest do a complicated thing he didn't have a word for. The waiter came to her table. They exchanged a few words. The waiter nodded once, reached over, and quietly picked up the second menu. The second water glass stayed, full, untouched. Evan had been in this restaurant dozens of times. He'd eaten here with Claire when Mia was still small enough to sleep through entire dinners in her carrier. He'd come with the crew after a particularly brutal week, back when Kenny's predecessor had flooded the third floor. He knew this place. He knew what the woman sitting alone at a table for two looked like to every other person in that room. He knew because he had looked like that once, after. He picked up his food when they called his name, tucked the bag under his arm, and started toward the exit. He got halfway through the door. The cold air hit him, late October in Silver Ridge, which meant it was already serious cold, the kind that came down off the mountains without apology. And he stood there with one hand on the doorframe and his takeout bag getting heavier, and the rational part of his brain composing a very reasonable argument for why he should just go home. He looked back. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table in front of her, the untouched water glass still catching the candlelight, her eyes on the middle distance. Not looking at her phone anymore. Not looking at anything, really. Just occupying space in a room full of people who weren't alone and doing it with the practiced composure of someone who had learned to keep her face very still when she was embarrassed. The thing about Evan Calder was that he was not an impulsive man. He was a man who thought carefully and acted slowly, who measured twice and cut once, who had spent 8 years making steady, sensible decisions because a little girl was counting on him to hold everything together. He did not do things without reason. He did not insert himself into other people's evenings. He had a hot dinner getting colder and a quiet apartment waiting, and every sensible justification in the world to keep walking. He turned around and went back inside. She looked up when he approached, and her expression moved through 3 things in quick succession. Surprise, a flash of something that might have been embarrassment, and then a careful neutrality that settled over her face like a curtain. "I'm sorry," he said, which was not what he'd planned to open with, but it came out anyway. "I don't usually do this. I'm not—" He paused. "I saw your date cancel." Her chin came up slightly. "I'm sorry?" The waiter took the menu. He shifted the takeout bag to his other hand. "And you flipped your phone over." She studied him for a moment. Close up, she had the kind of stillness that reminded Evan of certain very competent people he'd worked with over the years. The ones who never raised their voice and never showed you what they were actually thinking. Her eyes were dark and careful and not unkind. "You were watching me," she said. "I was waiting for my order." He gestured vaguely toward the back counter. "I noticed. It wasn't like that." "Like what?" He didn't have a great answer for that. "I don't know, just, you looked like you were having a rough night, and He stopped, tried again. "I've sat at a table like that after my wife died. You're doing the face." She blinked. The face. The "I'm fine and nothing is wrong and I definitely plan to eat alone" face. He gave it a beat. It's a specific face. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the thing that comes just before one. "He was 40 minutes late," she said. And then he texted. To cancel. She lifted her water glass, seemed to think better of drinking from it, set it down. "With a GIF." Evan stared at her. A GIF. A shrugging emoji GIF. He considered his words. "That's genuinely terrible." "Yes," she said, with the flat certainty of someone who has had time to arrive at that conclusion and is still mildly astonished by it. He stood there for another second. Then he gestured at the empty chair. "I have linguine with clams, and what I'm told is very good bread," he said. "And I'm going home to an empty apartment. You want some company? I promise I'll leave the moment it becomes weird." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that didn't have time to be polished or appropriate. She pressed one hand briefly to her mouth, and when she lowered it, her eyes were slightly brighter than they'd been a moment ago. "Sit down," she said. Her name was Vivienne Whitmore. He didn't know that yet when he sat down. He found it out about 4 minutes in, when she said it the way people say their name when they're used to it producing a reaction and are faintly curious whether it will. It didn't produce one. "Evan Calder," he said, and offered his hand across the table. She shook it. Her grip was firm and unsurprised. "Maintenance supervisor," he added, Silver Ridge Municipal Complex. I fix things when they break. What kinds of things? Heating systems, mostly. HVAC. Plumbing when it gets bad enough. Anything the building owns that stops working the way it's supposed to. He paused. The city owns a lot of things that stop working. That sounds like steady employment. Colorado winters guarantee it. She almost smiled again. She had been ordering the salmon, she told him, which the waiter confirmed was still possible, and Evan opened his takeout containers on the table between them because it seemed rude to eat out of a bag while she had an actual plate coming. The bread, he noted, was in fact very good. The restaurant kept moving around them. Later, Evan would have trouble explaining how the conversation went the way it did. He'd had dinners with women before. Not many, but a few, carefully arranged double dates or setups by well-meaning coworkers that had mostly collapsed under the weight of everyone trying too hard. Those evenings had a particular texture, careful questions, rehearsed answers, both people performing a version of themselves that was slightly better looking and more interesting than the reality. This was not that. Maybe it was the circumstance. Neither of them had planned it. Neither of them had prepared for it, and so there was no performance ready to deploy. Maybe it was Vivienne herself, who listened in a way that most people didn't, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually absorbing what he said, her eyes steady and attentive. Or maybe it was that she was very easy to talk to when you weren't trying to impress her. He told her about Mia, about the particular challenge of raising an 8-year-old girl who was simultaneously terrified of spiders and absolutely convinced she could solve every mechanical problem in the apartment by herself. About the week Mia had tried to fix the bathroom faucet, and he'd come home to find 6 inches of water on the tile floor and his daughter standing in it in her rain boots, fully confident the situation was under control. Vivienne laughed at that. Not politely. Actually laughed, the way the story deserved. "What did you do?" she asked. "Turned off the main valve, then I stood there for a while trying to decide whether to be angry or impressed. She'd actually identified the right problem, just hadn't gotten to the solution part yet." "How old was she?" 6. 6 and a quarter, she would have told you. The quarter mattered. "They always do," Vivienne said, and something moved through her expression. Not quite sadness, but something adjacent to it, something that had history in it. He asked her what she did. She told him, without fanfare or build-up, in the same even voice she'd used to describe the shrugging emoji text. He nodded slowly. "Real estate," he said. "Hospitality and development. We build things. Sometimes we buy things that already exist and make them into different things." "What kind of things?" "Hotels, residential towers, a few mixed-use properties. We're finishing a resort project in Telluride that's been—" She paused, seemed to decide against the full version. "Complicated." "Complicated how?" She gave him a look that was equal parts amused and tired. "The original architect's vision involved a glass floor over a 40-foot drop, and he's very attached to it." "Is it load-bearing?" "Theoretically." "Is it in the contract?" "Unfortunately." "Huh." He chewed bread thoughtfully. "Have you tried framing it as a safety feature instead of a liability? Sometimes people need to hear the same thing in a different direction." She looked at him. "I mean," he shrugged, "I deal with building people, contractors, engineers, inspectors. Everybody's more reasonable when they think the idea was theirs." She was quiet for a moment. "That is actually useful," she said. "Don't tell your architect I said it." "I absolutely will not." It was when the check came. Evan reaching for it, Vivienne already handing her card to the waiter with the decisive speed of someone for whom the calculation had been made before the waiter even arrived, that he noticed the other thing. It had been building for a while, quietly, beneath the surface of the conversation. She knew things she shouldn't have known. Not dramatically, not in a way that was easy to pin down, but she'd asked about the hiking trail near the reservoir, as if she already knew he preferred it to the main park routes. She'd offered milk before he asked for it when they moved the coffee cups around, and he drank his coffee with milk and 2 sugars, which was not a thing he'd mentioned. When he said brisket, she'd said properly smoked before he'd finished the sentence, and he'd let it pass at the time because the conversation was moving too fast. But now, sitting here with the evening winding down and his takeout containers stacked neatly at the edge of the table, he turned it over. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can try." "How did you know about the reservoir trail?" She went very still. "I hike," she said, which was technically an answer. And the coffee. I didn't say milk. A pause, shorter than it should have been. Lucky guess, she said. You look like a milk person. He watched her face. Something was happening behind her eyes that she was working to keep from reaching the surface. She was good at it. But Evan spent his days reading building systems, finding the small signs that something was running wrong beneath a surface that looked fine. He'd gotten good at noticing the thing underneath the visible thing. Vivienne, he said. She looked at him. Did we? He started. Stopped. Tried to sort it. Have we met before? The pause this time was longer. Not exactly, she said. He waited. She looked down at the table, then back up at him. Something had shifted in her expression. Not quite the controlled composure she'd been wearing all evening. Something more careful. More honest. More like the face under the face. Lauren, she said. Lauren Whitmore, my younger sister. Evan sat with that for a moment. Lauren. He hadn't thought about Lauren in a long time. They had dated for 5, maybe 6 months. It had ended cleanly, no damage, no resentment, just two people arriving at the honest conclusion that they wanted different things and respecting each other enough to say so. He still thought of her occasionally, the way you thought of anyone who had been good to you for a specific period of time. She's your sister, he said. Yes. And she told you about me. Vivienne met his eyes. She mentioned you several times, and you came to a few family dinners. She stopped. I have a good memory. It came out carefully, but not quite carefully enough. He thought about the hiking trail, the coffee, the way she'd said properly smoked without hesitation. A good memory. Okay, Evan said slowly. He didn't push it further. Not because he didn't have more questions, but because something in her face told him he had already gotten further than she'd intended, and there was a particular dignity to the way she was holding herself together that he didn't want to pull apart just to satisfy his curiosity. He let it sit. They finished their coffee. Outside the restaurant, on the sidewalk in the cold October air, they exchanged numbers with the casual ease of people who are pretending it's less significant than it is. Vivienne's breath made small clouds in the dark. She had a driver waiting, a dark car idling at the curb that Evan hadn't noticed until now, and she glanced at it, then back at him. Thank you, she said, for sitting down. Anytime someone waves a gif at you, he said, consider calling. She laughed again, and this time she let it run a little longer. He watched the car pull away and stood there on the sidewalk outside Caruso's with his empty takeout bag in his hand, and something in his chest doing the complicated thing again, the thing he didn't have a name for. He had a good memory too, as it happened, and he was already sure he'd remember this one. He didn't text her that night. He thought about it, twice actually, once when he was still sitting in his truck in the parking lot outside Caruso's with the heater running and the windows fogging up, and once later when he was home and the apartment was doing its particular brand of quiet that only happened when Mia wasn't in it. But both times he put the phone down. It felt too fast. Or maybe too much. He wasn't entirely sure which one it was, and when he couldn't tell the difference, he'd learned that waiting was usually the smarter move. He made himself a cup of coffee he didn't really want, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the takeout containers from Caruso's that he'd forgotten to throw away before he left. The bread was still in the bag. He took a piece, ate it cold, and stared at the chair across from him that Mia usually occupied. The apartment had 17 things that needed fixing. He kept a running list, which was the maintenance man's version of counting sheep. Replace the seal on the bathroom faucet, recaulk the window in the spare room, figure out why the third burner on the stove clicked 4 times before it caught. The list was a comfort. It meant tomorrow had a shape to it. He went to bed at 10:15 and stared at the ceiling for an hour. She texted him first. It came through at 11:40, which struck him as either brave or spontaneous, and with Vivienne Whitmore, he was already starting to suspect those two things might be the same. The bread was excellent. I should have ordered that instead of the salmon. He read it twice. Then he typed, I tried to tell you. Her response came back in under a minute. You did not try hard enough. In my defense, you handed your card over before I could finish the sentence. I'm decisive. It's a professional hazard. He was smiling at his phone in a dark room, and he was aware of exactly how that looked, and he did it anyway. How's the shrugging gift situation? He typed. Deleted the contact. I feel better. Good call. It was, frankly, the best decision I made today. Second best. He waited to see if she'd clarify. She didn't, and he let it sit, and they said goodnight, and he put the phone on the nightstand and fell asleep faster than he had in months. The week that followed had its own strange texture. He went to work Monday and fixed a cooling unit on the fourth floor that had been struggling since September, and replaced a section of pipe in the basement that two different plumbers had quoted as being fine and wasn't. He picked Mia up from school on Tuesday and Wednesday, helped her with a math worksheet that was allegedly about fractions but was in practice about how long a person could sit at a kitchen table before losing their mind, and made chicken and rice on Thursday because it was the only thing they both agreed on without negotiation. It was the same week it always was. He was the same person doing the same things, except Vivienne texted him every day. Not constantly. Not in the aggressive way that felt like someone performing interest rather than having it, just present. A message in the morning when she was on her way into the office, sometimes a photo of something she'd seen that she thought he'd find funny or strange. A construction site crane in an improbable position. A coffee cup that had his order written on it in handwriting so bad it looked like a medical document. A news headline about a heating system failure in a Denver high-rise that she'd sent with no comment except a single question mark and his name. Calder. You seen this? He had already seen it. He sent back the 3 things they'd done wrong and the one thing that would have prevented all of it, and she'd responded, I'm forwarding this to my Telluride team. Is that okay? Knock yourself out, he'd written. I'm serious. This is actually useful. I know, he'd written back. That's why I said knock yourself out. She'd sent back a laughing emoji and then a follow-up that said, you're strange, and he'd thought about it for a moment and typed, you're not the first person to say that, and she'd said, I bet I'm the most accurate, and he hadn't had a good response for that, so he just sent a thumbs up, which in retrospect was not his finest moment, but she didn't seem to mind. They texted every day for 2 weeks before he asked if she wanted to get coffee. He'd made it casual on purpose, or tried to, mentioned he'd be near the east side of town Thursday morning for a supply pickup, and there was a place on Ridgeline that he'd been going to for years if she wanted to meet up. No pressure, just coffee. He read it over 3 times before he sent it, and still wasn't happy with it, and sent it anyway. She said yes in 30 seconds. The coffee place was called Perk, which was a terrible name for a coffee shop that happened to make exceptional coffee, and the owners had clearly decided long ago to let the product make the argument for them, because the interior was just 4 tables and a counter and a chalkboard with 3 options on it. Evan had been going there since Mia was 4, and he still wasn't sure the owner knew his name, but she recognized his face and had his order started before he reached the counter. Vivienne arrived 4 minutes late in a coat that cost more than his truck and carrying a laptop bag that suggested she'd come from something and was going to something, and this was a detour she'd made deliberately. She looked at the interior of Perk, took it in with a single sweep, and sat down across from him with the easy adaptability of someone who had learned to be comfortable in most rooms. I expected something different, she said. The name's misleading. I meant more that I expected you to pick somewhere with at least 2 menu options. They have 3, espresso, drip, or a thing they call the mountain, which is espresso with steamed oat milk and a quantity of cinnamon that I think counts as a commitment. What do you get? Drip with milk. Of course you do. He watched her face. How did you know I'd say that? She met his eyes, and for just a second something moved through her expression, quick and difficult to read, and then the careful composure was back in place. You mentioned it, at dinner. He didn't remember mentioning it, but he let it go. The coffee came. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way people did when they were colder than they'd admitted, and he noticed she'd ordered drip too, which made him irrationally pleased in a way he couldn't justify. They talked for an hour and 15 minutes. He knew this because when he looked up, the supply pickup he'd planned was starting in 40 minutes, and he was across town, which meant he was either going to be late or he was going to have to leave now, and he sat there for a full 10 seconds, making that calculation and failing to stand up. You have somewhere to be, Vivienne said. It wasn't a question. Supply pickup. I've got a window. Go. I'm going. He stood, put his jacket on, and then stood there like an idiot with his jacket on for another few seconds. Same time next week? He said. She looked up at him from behind her coffee cup. Thursday, she said. Thursday became a standing thing. Not explicitly. Nobody said, let's make this a standing thing, because that would have required admitting it was something, and they were both apparently committed to the fiction that they were two adults who occasionally drank coffee in the same room. But the following Thursday he showed up at Perk at 9:15 and she was already there, and the Thursday after that she'd texted at 9 to say she was running 10 minutes behind, which meant she'd had it in her calendar, which meant it was a standing thing whether they called it that or not. Mia found out about Vivienne by accident, the way Mia found out about most things. She had a talent for it, for walking into rooms at the precise moment a conversation arrived at its most informative point, or for asking exactly the question you weren't ready to answer yet. Claire had been the same way. Evan sometimes thought it skipped the generation in between. It was a Sunday morning in mid-November. Evan was making eggs and Mia was at the kitchen table working on something for school, her tongue between her teeth the way it went when she was concentrating hard, and his phone lit up on the counter. Mia looked at it before he could. "Who's Vivienne?" she said. "A friend. It says she wants to know if you watched the documentary about the—" She squinted at the screen. "The collapse of the Hartford Hotel, whatever that is. It's a building thing. You have a friend who watches building documentaries?" Apparently. Mia studied him with the focused attention she usually reserved for math problems that weren't adding up. "Is she a building person?" "She builds things, yeah." "Like you?" "Not quite like me." He slid the eggs onto 2 plates and carried them to the table. Different scale. Mia accepted this with the easy practicality of an 8-year-old, picked up her fork, and went back to her worksheet. Then, 30 seconds later, without looking up, "Is she a girlfriend?" "No." "Does she know that?" Evan put his fork down and looked at his daughter. Mia was examining her eggs with complete innocence, the kind that was slightly too complete to be entirely genuine. "Eat your breakfast," he said. "I'm asking a real question." "I know you are. Eat your breakfast." Mia ate her breakfast, but she was smiling at her plate in a way that Evan chose not to examine too closely. He told Vivienne about that conversation the following Thursday, mostly because he thought it would make her laugh. And it did. She covered her mouth with her hand the way she did when a laugh caught her off guard, and she hadn't had time to make it polished. "She's not wrong to ask," Vivienne said. "She's 8. 8-year-olds ask the questions everyone else is too careful to ask." He looked at her across the small table. "Is that what you're doing? Being too careful?" She set her cup down. The pause was maybe half a beat too long. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. And it came out honest in a way that seemed to surprise her, like she'd reached for something diplomatic and picked up the truth instead. Outside the window, the first serious snow of the season was starting to fall in Silver Ridge, big, slow flakes that stuck to the glass and melted slowly. The street was already going white. Inside Perk, the radiator was clicking in the corner in the particular way that meant it was working harder than it wanted to, and Evan listened to it automatically, the way he always did, reading the building the way other people read rooms. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not—" He stopped, reorganized. "I spent a long time after Claire not doing this at all. Any of it. So the pace doesn't bother me. I just don't want to be sitting here having coffee every Thursday and not know what we're doing." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "It's not a demand. I'm just being honest." "I know." She looked at her cup, then back up at him. "I'm not very good at this." "At what?" "At—" She made a small gesture with one hand, vague and uncharacteristically imprecise. "This, people, letting people—" She stopped. "In," he offered. "I was going to say close enough to matter, but yes, that." He thought about what she'd said. The careful composure she wore in public, the way she'd sat alone at that table with her dignity arranged just so while the second water glass sat untouched. The way she listened, not like someone performing attention, but like someone for whom information was the only currency she fully trusted. "You're good at people," he said. "You're just selective." She gave him a look that was partly skeptical and partly something else. "I build things for people to live and work in," she said. "That doesn't mean I'm good at them." "You remembered my coffee order from a dinner you attended as someone's sister," he said. "Before I told you." The air between them changed. He watched it happen. The shift in her posture, small and careful, the way her hands stilled around the cup. "You noticed that," she said. Not a question. "I notice things. It's the job." She was quiet. Outside, the snow was coming faster. A woman passing on the sidewalk had stopped to watch it, her face turned up. "It wasn't just the coffee," Evan said. "You knew about the trail. You said properly smoked before I finished the sentence. You knew the name of—" He stopped. "What was the dog's name? I haven't thought about him in years." Vivienne looked at him steadily. "Cooper," she said. Evan sat with that. "I mentioned Cooper once," he said. "At a dinner, probably 4 years ago." "I told you," she said quietly. "I have a good memory." "Vivienne." She looked at him. "That's not a good memory," he said. "That's something else." The pause this time was longer than any of the previous ones. She was doing the thing with her face again, the careful management of the surface. But underneath it, something was working, turning, coming to some private decision. "You're right," she said finally, quietly. "It is something else." He waited. She opened her mouth, closed it, pressed her lips together. "Not today," she said. Can I have a little more time?" He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. "Okay," he said. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'm going to need an answer eventually." "I know." She wrapped her hands around her cup again. "I know you will." The weeks that followed were the best and most confusing of Evan's recent life. Vivienne met Mia for the first time on an accident that was only partially an accident. It was a Saturday afternoon. Evan and Mia were coming out of the hardware store on Main with a bag of parts for the bathroom faucet, and Vivienne was coming around the corner in the opposite direction with her phone in her hand and her head down. She would have walked past entirely, except that Mia said, "Is that your building friend?" at a volume that made 3 people turn around. Vivienne stopped. Mia looked up at her with the frank, unfiltered evaluation that 8-year-olds deployed on new people, the kind of assessment that took in everything and reported only the conclusions. "You're taller than I thought," Mia said. "I get that sometimes," Vivienne said. "Are you the one who watches building documentaries with my dad?" "On separate televisions and separate locations." "That's still watching together," Mia said, with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned to be embarrassed by her own logic. Vivienne looked at Evan over Mia's head, and her expression did a complicated thing that resolved itself into something warm and slightly undone, like a person who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found another. "She's right," Vivienne said. "It is." They walked to the coffee shop. Not Perk, the other one, the one with the hot chocolate that Mia had strong opinions about, and sat for 40 minutes. Mia told Vivienne about the bathroom faucet project with the thoroughness of someone presenting a business case, including the failed first attempt when she was 6, the flooding, the rain boots, and her current revised theory about why the seal had gone bad. Vivienne listened with her full attention, the same way she listened to Evan, and asked 3 specific questions that made Mia sit up straighter. She knew the right questions, Mia said in the car on the way home. She said it the way she said things that had impressed her, but that she wasn't quite ready to fully admit had impressed her. "She's smart," Evan said. "She's really smart." A pause. "She didn't talk to me like I was little." "No, she doesn't really do that." Another pause. Outside, Silver Ridge was white and still in the late afternoon cold. "I liked her," Mia said. The declaration had the weight of a verdict. Evan drove. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." I was standing in the break room on the 3rd floor of the municipal building on a Tuesday morning, waiting for the ancient coffee maker to finish its labored process, when Kenny leaned in the doorway and said, "You look different lately." "I look the same," Evan said. "You're humming." "I'm not humming." "You were humming when you came in this morning. You hummed through the entire HVAC inspection." Evan turned around. Kenny was looking at him with the expression of a man who had worked alongside Evan Calder for 6 years and therefore had extensive baseline data. "It's nothing," Evan said. "Okay," Kenny said, in the voice of someone for whom it was clearly not nothing, but who had decided to let the man work it out on his own timetable. Evan turned back to the coffee maker. He was, he realized, humming. Boca. The message came on a Wednesday night in late November. He'd just finished the bathroom faucet. The real fix this time, not the patch job he'd done 3 months ago. And he was washing up at the kitchen sink when his phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up with wet hands and read it. "I think we need to slow down." He stood there for a moment, water dripping from his fingers. He read it again, in case it meant something different the second time. It didn't. He typed back, "Can you tell me why?" The response took 11 minutes, which he spent not doing anything in particular, just standing at the kitchen counter in a way that was different from how he usually stood there. It's complicated. I'm sorry. Vivienne, I know. I need some time to think. He put the phone down. He picked it back up. "I'm not going anywhere," he typed. "But I'd like to understand what changed." No response came that night. He woke up in the morning to 3 words. Nothing changed. Everything. He read it 5 times and couldn't make it make sense, and went to work with the particular flat feeling of something deflating that you'd been carrying inflated for longer than you'd realized. The next Thursday, she didn't come to Perk. She texted at 8:50 to say she had an emergency call with the Telluride team, which was plausible, and he said it was fine, which was technically true. He sat at the small table by the window with his drip coffee and watched the street for a while and then went to do his supply pickup and didn't hum on the way back. The week after that, she was in Denver for meetings. The week after that, she was available, but her message came with a careful formality to it, a small, precise distance that hadn't been there before. The way a room feels different when the furniture has been rearranged slightly, and you can tell something has moved but can't immediately say what. He didn't push. He told her he wasn't in a hurry, and he'd meant it, but he also hadn't meant this. This was not a pace. This was something pulling back from something, carefully, with both hands. He tried to locate the moment it had changed, and couldn't. The last real Thursday they'd had, before the canceled coffees and the Denver trips, she'd been fine. Good, even. She'd laughed more than usual and told him a story about the Telluride architect that had gotten genuinely animated, her hands moving in a way they usually didn't. She'd looked at him when he was talking, that steady, attentive look, and he'd felt it the way you felt actual things rather than imagined ones. And then 11 days later, "I think we need to slow down." He thought about it more than he wanted to. He mentioned it to nobody except Kenny, and only because Kenny walked into the break room one afternoon and found Evan staring at the wall above the coffee maker with the expression of a man doing very unsuccessful math. "Still nothing?" Kenny said. "Still nothing? You want my advice?" "No." "Ask her directly," Kenny said. "The worst she can do is tell you something true." Evan looked at him. "That's not comforting." "It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be useful." Kenny poured himself a coffee. "You've been doing the thing where you wait for people to be ready. You do it with the building systems too. You wait until you understand the problem completely before you touch anything. That's a good way to not make things worse. It's also a good way to stand in a hallway for 2 months while the heat goes out." Kenny took his coffee and left. Evan stood there a while longer. Then he picked up his phone and typed, "Can we meet?" "Not Perk. Somewhere quiet. I want to talk." The response came in 4 minutes. "Yes," she wrote. "I think I owe you that." He stared at that last sentence for a long time. "I think I owe you that. Not of course, or I'd like that, or even just yes." She had chosen a word that meant obligation. Like what was coming was something she'd been carrying around and had finally decided to put down. And the putting down wasn't going to feel good for either of them. He wrote back, "Saturday. The cafe on terrace, the one with the fireplace." She wrote back, "Okay." He set the phone down. He went back to work. But the flat feeling from before had changed shape. It was heavier now, and denser, and complicated by something underneath it that he didn't have a name for yet. The particular unease of understanding that you are about to find out something that has been true for a long time, something that was already shaped before you arrived, something that the person across from you has been holding alone for years while you walked around without the first idea it existed. Whatever Vivienne Whitmore had been carrying, she had been carrying it carefully, and she was about to put it down. Saturday came in cold and gray, the kind of December morning in Silver Ridge where the mountains disappeared entirely behind low cloud, and the town felt smaller than usual, compressed into its own valley, with nowhere to look but inward. Evan woke at 6:15 out of habit, Mia's habit specifically. She was a natural early riser who had decided years ago that sleeping past 7 was a form of waste, and the pattern had restructured his internal clock so thoroughly that even on mornings she was at Carol's, his eyes opened on schedule. He lay there for a while listening to the particular silence of the apartment without her in it, The kind of quiet that was fine during the week when he was tired enough not to notice, but that had a different texture on weekend mornings. He got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street below, which was empty and dusted with fresh snow that nobody had walked through yet. The cafe on terrace wasn't until 10. He had 4 hours. He fixed the third burner on the stove, the one that clicked 4 times before it caught. It took 40 minutes and a part he'd been meaning to order for 3 weeks. Then he recaulked the window in the spare room, which he'd had on the list since September. Then he sat on the edge of Mia's bed in the quiet and looked at the drawings she'd taped to the wall above her desk. A horse, a floor plan of a building she'd designed herself with labeled rooms and a notation that said, Mia's office, no dad's, and a drawing of the two of them that she'd done last year where they were both stick figures of approximately equal height, which was generous to him and aspirational for her. He thought about Vivienne saying, I think I owe you that. He thought about it the way you turned a strange object over in your hands, looking for the angle that made sense of it. At 9:30, he put his jacket on and drove to Terrace Street. The cafe was called Ember, which was a better name than Perk, and a more honest one. It was warm in the way that took you a minute to adjust to when you came in from the cold, with a stone fireplace along the far wall that was doing actual work, and not just decoration. The kind of place that had probably been a bookshop once, based on the shelves still built into the walls and the particular smell of old wood that no amount of coffee could fully replace. Vivienne was already there. She was at a table near the fireplace, not because she'd gotten the best seat, but because she'd arrived early and taken the most defensible position, her back to the wall, clear sight lines to the door. She was wearing a dark sweater and her hair was down, which he'd only seen twice before, and she looked less like the woman photographed at galas and more like the woman who had laughed at a shrugging emoji gif in a crowded Italian restaurant, which was the version of her he'd been thinking about for weeks. She saw him come in. Something moved through her face and then went still. He ordered a coffee at the counter and brought it to the table and sat down across from her. You're early, he said. I couldn't sleep. Me either. She wrapped both hands around her mug. The fireplace behind her threw warm light across the table and made the shadows move in slow patterns on the wall. Before you say anything, she said, I want to tell you something. Okay? She looked at the table, then up at him. I handled this badly, the pulling back, the canceled Thursdays. You didn't deserve that. You were honest with me and I gave you a text message that didn't explain anything, and I'm sorry for that. I'm not here for an apology. I know, but I needed to say it first. She exhaled slowly. Can I explain? That's why I'm here. She nodded once. Then she was quiet for a moment, and he could see her organizing something. Not rehearsing exactly, but finding the right entrance into something that had a lot of rooms. When Lauren first introduced you, she began, it was a Sunday dinner, end of January. You'd been dating her for maybe 3 weeks, I think. She called me the night before and told me she'd met someone and he was different from the others, and she wanted me to meet him. Vivienne paused. She was happy. She had that particular voice she gets when something is genuinely good. Evan was still. I remember you came in with a bottle of wine that you were holding slightly wrong, Vivienne said. Like you'd grabbed it on the way over and weren't sure of the protocol. And Lauren introduced us and you shook my hand and said, it was nice to meet me, and then you immediately asked my father whether the kitchen faucet had always dripped or if it was new, because you could hear it from across the room. She almost smiled. My father talked to you for 20 minutes about that faucet. Evan remembered the faucet. He'd replaced the washer after dinner while Lauren's mother made coffee. He didn't remember Vivienne being in the room when he'd noticed it. I was at the table, she said as if she'd heard the question. You couldn't see me from the kitchen. He sat with that. You stayed 3 hours, she said. You helped my mother carry dishes even though she told you not to. You talked to my father about his work. He used to be a civil engineer before he retired, and I could tell you were actually interested, not just being polite. And you talked about Mia. She stopped. She was 4. You talked about her not the way people talk about things that are hard. You talked about her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to you, and also the most baffling, and you were clearly going to figure it out no matter what it took. The fire made a sound behind her, settling, shifting. I went home that night, Vivienne said, and I thought, that's a man who knows what he's doing, not with women, not with... I don't mean that. I mean with his life. He knows what matters, and he doesn't pretend otherwise. She looked at the table. And then I thought, Lauren really likes him. She said it simply, with no inflection, the way you said the thing that ended the story before it started. So I put it away, she said. Whatever it was. It wasn't anything yet. It was just a thought, a recognition. I put it in a drawer and told myself it would be fine because it wasn't real yet, and there was no reason for it to become real, and Lauren was happy. Evan's coffee was cooling in front of him. He hadn't touched it. How long? He said. How long what? How long did you? 5 months, she said. Until you and Lauren ended it, and then another. She stopped, recalculated, and then longer after. The word longer sat between them on the table. Vivienne, he said. I never said anything to her, she said quickly. I want to be clear about that. I never, not while you were together, not after, not ever. I didn't interfere, I didn't compete, She pressed her lips together. I went to those family dinners and you would be there sometimes, in the first few months after you and Lauren ended, because you were all still on reasonable terms and families are complicated. And you'd talk and I'd listen and I'd put it in the drawer again. But you remembered everything, Evan said. Yes. Cooper, the trail, the coffee. Yes. He looked at her face, at the careful composure that had been her default in every conversation they'd had, the management of the surface that he'd noticed from the beginning. He understood now what was underneath it, or he was beginning to. When I sat down at Caruso's, he said. I almost told you to go, she said. I thought about it. When you were standing there with your takeout bag asking if you could sit, I thought, if I say no thank you, this doesn't have to be a problem. I can let it be a coincidence I ran into my sister's former boyfriend and we were both at the same restaurant and nothing came of it. She looked at him steadily. And then you said you're doing the face, and I couldn't. He almost said something. He let her finish. I don't know why that was the thing, she said quietly, of everything, but nobody had ever just seen it, without me explaining it or making it convenient for them to see it. You just looked across the room and saw me sitting there doing the thing I do when I'm embarrassed, and I hadn't told you anything and you already knew. She stopped. I couldn't tell you to go. The cafe moved around them. A couple at a nearby table, the person at the counter refilling their cup, the fire. Evan picked up his coffee, drank some of it, set it back down. And the pulling back, he said, the slow down text. She looked at her hands. Lauren called me, Vivienne said. About 3 weeks after Caruso's. She called to check in the way she does sometimes. We're close, we always have been. We're just not in each other's business. And she asked how things were going, and I was tired, and I wasn't careful enough, and she said, Vivienne, what's going on? And She paused. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. I told her I'd run into you, that we'd had dinner. What did she say? She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, you like him, and she didn't ask it, she said it, like she already knew. Maybe she did. Vivienne looked at him. Maybe. I don't know. Sisters know things. She shook her head. I told her I didn't know what I was doing, that it had been accidental. She said I didn't have to explain it to her, and I said, I felt like I did, and she said, she stopped. What? She said, does he know you've liked him since January? The January he came to dinner with me? Vivienne let out a breath. And I said no. And she said, well, that seems like it might be relevant. Evan was quiet for a moment. She wasn't angry, he said. She was. Vivienne thought about it. She had a tone, not anger, something more complicated. And then she said she needed to think, and we hung up, and that was when I sent you the slowdown text because I had completely panicked. She looked at him with the directness that was her truest mode, underneath all the composure. I panicked. I'm not going to make it sound more reasoned than that. You panicked because of Lauren, because of what it means, to want someone my sister dated, to actually. She stopped, started again. Lauren and I don't have a lot of family left, our parents, each other. That's mostly it. And I've spent years being the person who doesn't complicate things, who handles her own business, who doesn't put her feelings in other people's way. I'm very good at it professionally. I'm very good at it personally. She paused. Apparently I'm less good at it when the person sits down uninvited at a table I'm embarrassed to be at and says exactly the right thing. Evan looked at her for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "For sitting down." She blinked. "What?" "I'm sorry I made it complicated." "Don't be." She said it quickly, with a sharpness that surprised him. "Don't apologize for that, please." "Okay. I'm glad you sat down." She said it like a confession, like something she'd been deciding whether to say for weeks and had finally landed on the side of saying it. "That's the problem. I'm glad you sat down and I can't make myself not be glad. And it's—" She stopped. "Inconvenient?" he offered. The corner of her mouth moved. "Extremely." He reached across the table. Not for her hand, just close enough that if she wanted to, she could close the distance. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Okay." "I noticed you," he said, "at those dinners. When I was with Lauren, I noticed you were quiet in the way that certain people are quiet. Not because they don't have anything to say, but because they're listening to everything. And I remember thinking, that's a serious person, not as a value judgment, just she takes things seriously, the way she sits, the way she listens. She doesn't perform it." He paused. "And then I didn't think about it again because I was with your sister, and it wasn't anything." Vivienne was very still. "But I noticed," he said. "I want you to know I noticed." The fire made its sound again. Outside the window, the snow had started falling. Not heavy, just the light, floating kind that came down sideways in small gusts. It was not the clean resolution that the moment seemed to be setting up for. Evan knew that. He could feel it in the way Vivienne was holding herself even after the telling. The tension still present in her shoulders, the way her hands stayed wrapped around the mug instead of loosening. Telling the truth didn't automatically resolve the thing the truth was about. He was old enough to know that. Sometimes the telling was just the first door, and behind it were more doors, and some of them were going to be harder than this one. "What happens now?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "What do you want to happen?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who had spent years asking other people's "what do you want?" questions, and being careful never to answer the same question about herself. "I'm not sure I'm good at answering that." "Try." She was quiet for long enough that he started to think she might not answer. Then she said, "I want to not have this be something we can't come back from." "Which this? You and me or you and Lauren?" "Both," she said. "Either." She exhaled. "All of it." "Okay," he said. "That's not an answer. That's just—" "It's enough," he said. "For today. It's enough." She looked at him with something that might have been relief and might have been skepticism. And in her case, the two often lived close enough together that it was hard to tell which was which. He drove home with the snow coming down and the radio off and a lot to think about. He thought about the January dinner he barely remembered, the faucet, the wine, Lauren's family in the kitchen, the person at the table he apparently hadn't looked at carefully enough. He thought about 5 months and then longer, and what it cost to carry something in silence that long. He thought about the drawer she'd described, the act of putting it away, and putting it away, and putting it away, until the night she walked into a restaurant and found her empty chair already occupied. He thought about Lauren, not with guilt exactly, because there was no wrong thing done, at least not the kind with clear edges, but with the particular discomfort of knowing that somewhere in the equation was a woman he'd genuinely liked, who had found out that her sister had feelings for a man she'd once brought home, and who had been quiet on the phone about it in a way that had its own weather. He parked outside his building and sat in the truck for a minute. Then he called Mia to check in. She answered immediately. She always answered immediately, like she'd been holding the phone in anticipation, and said Grandma Carol was making soup, and could he bring her good boots when he picked her up because she wanted to walk in the snow and her school boots were ugly. "Your school boots are fine," he said. "They're fine for school," Mia said with careful distinction. "They're ugly for snow." He told her he'd bring the boots. She told him Grandma had bought a puzzle and it was 900 pieces and she was already suspicious. He told her he'd be there by 4. She said, "Okay, bye," and hung up. He sat there another few seconds. Then he went inside. He didn't hear from Vivienne that night. He hadn't expected to exactly, but he noticed the absence the way you noticed a sound stopping. The next morning, Sunday, he took the boots to Carol's, picked up Mia, and walked with her through the fresh snow along the path by the reservoir while she tested exactly how close to the edge of ice she could get before he called her back. It was 28 degrees, and Mia was describing in comprehensive detail a theory she had about why certain snowflakes were structurally superior to others. And Evan listened and made the right sounds in the right places and let the cold clear his head. On Monday, he went to work. On Tuesday, something happened that he did not expect. It was raining by Tuesday, a miserable, sleety kind of rain that Silver Ridge got in December when the temperature couldn't decide whether it wanted to snow properly or just make everything wet and gray. Evan had been out to 3 different buildings for inspection calls and was heading back to the office when he decided to stop at the bookstore on Clement Street, which was a thing he did occasionally for no clear reason except that Mia liked to look at the architecture books, and he'd gotten into the habit. The shop was warm and almost empty in the midday rain. He moved through the front section toward the back shelves where the nonfiction was and didn't particularly register the voices from the adjacent aisle until one of them said Vivienne in a tone that cut through everything else. He stopped. He wasn't the type of person who eavesdropped. He knew that about himself with some confidence. But the aisle was narrow and the rain was loud against the front window and the voice was close, and before he'd made any conscious decision about it, he was standing still with a book in his hand that he wasn't reading. "I just think she's been carrying this too long." A woman's voice. Young, familiar in its cadence in the way that voices from the same family were familiar, not Vivienne. "She does that. She puts everything in these perfect compartments, and then she manages them, and nobody ever knows there's anything happening underneath." A second voice, also a woman, one he didn't know. "She told you, though, eventually." "Only because I asked. Only because I said, 'Vivienne, what's going on?' in the right tone of voice at the right moment when she was too tired to deflect." A pause. "She's been like this since—" A slight hesitation, a breath of decision. "She liked him first. Did she tell you that? Before I even brought him home. She saw him somewhere and she mentioned him to me, and then a week later I introduced him to the family and she just—" The voice stopped. Started again. "She just stepped back. Completely. She stepped back and held the door open and didn't say a word." A long silence. "That's Lauren. I know. That's years. I know." Evan stood in the aisle with the book in his hand and the rain hitting the window and his pulse doing something loud in his ears. She liked him first. The words rearranged the room. They rearranged several rooms. He thought about the January dinner. He thought about Vivienne saying she called me the night before and you came in with a bottle of wine. He thought about the way she'd described noticing him, the careful clinical language she'd used, a recognition, a thought. I put it in a drawer. He'd heard it as the beginning of something. He understood now it was the middle. She had seen him somewhere before Lauren's dinner. She had mentioned him. And then Lauren had introduced him as the person she was dating, and Vivienne had stepped back and held the door. He thought about the years of family dinners, the way she'd remembered Cooper, the hiking trail, the coffee order, the properly smoked before he'd finished the sentence. She hadn't been building a file on him. She'd just been paying attention the way you paid attention to something that mattered to you, without any plan, without any agenda. Just the helpless attentiveness of someone who couldn't stop noticing. "Is she going to do anything about it?" the second voice said. "I told her to," Lauren said. "I told her there was nothing left to protect. Our relationship ended years ago, and it ended fine. And I don't have a claim on the man. I used to date him. That's all it is now." A pause. "But she's got this thing where she's decided she's the person who doesn't ask for things. She runs a billion-dollar company, and she negotiates with people twice her age, and she never backs down. And then when it's something she actually wants for herself—" Another pause, shorter, more frustrated. "She freezes. So tell her that." "I've told her." She listens, and then she does the face. The face. "I understand what you're saying, and I'm going to process it carefully, and then do the thing I was going to do anyway," face. Something in Lauren's voice that was between exasperation and affection. "She's been doing it since we were kids." Evan was still in the aisle. He became aware slowly that he had been standing in one spot for a long time. He put the book back on the shelf with the quiet of someone who had been somewhere he hadn't meant to be and was now leaving as carefully as he'd arrived. He moved back through the front section and out into the rain and stood on the sidewalk under the narrow overhang of the bookstore's awning while the cold water came down around him. She liked him first. Not she developed feelings later. Not she noticed him after. First. Before Lauren, before the dinner, before the faucet, and the wine, and the 3 hours and all of it. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He stood in the rain for a while. Then he walked back to his truck, got in, and sat there. He could do one of several things. He could call Vivienne right now. He could wait. He could pretend he hadn't heard anything and let her tell him in her own time. He stopped going through the options because none of them felt right, and he knew why. None of them accounted for what he just understood, which was that Vivienne Whitmore had been managing this situation around everyone else's feelings for years and years, cutting her own out of the equation with surgical precision, and he wasn't sure she knew how to stop. She had told him the story on Saturday. She had told him the cleaned-up version, the version where she was in control of the telling, where it started from a reasonable place and traveled through reasonable emotions. She'd left out the part where it started before she'd even had the chance to have a reason for it. She'd left out first. He didn't think she'd left it out to deceive him. He thought she'd left it out the way you left out the most important part of something, because the most important part was the part that was hardest to say, and you built up to it in circles, and sometimes the circles went on too long. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. He drove back to the office, checked in on the afternoon inspections, had a conversation with Kenny about the fourth-floor unit that was starting to run rough again, filed the paperwork that had been sitting on his desk since Thursday, and did not think about Vivienne Whitmore for the rest of the afternoon. This was not successful. That night, he put Mia to bed and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold without him drinking much of it. She'd asked him at dinner why he was quiet, and he'd said he was tired, and she'd accepted this with the evaluating look that suggested she had reservations but was willing to extend credit. He thought about a woman who ran a company with 3,000 employees who didn't know how to ask for something she wanted. He thought about she stepped back and held the door open. He thought about a January dinner he'd attended without knowing that someone at the table had already noticed him, had already put something quietly in a drawer, had already decided before he'd said a word to her that whatever she felt wasn't hers to act on. He thought about all the Thursdays she had shown up at Perk, all the texts that started in the morning and ran through the day, the way she'd asked about Mia with a specificity that wasn't casual. She'd remembered the rain boots, the floor plan drawing, the worksheet about fractions. She'd remembered the things Evan mentioned once, the way she always remembered the things Evan mentioned once. He thought about the best date I've had in a very long time, set across a table in Caruso's in October, with the candlelight and the untouched second water glass. He thought about what it cost to say that, for her specifically. What it cost to let that out after everything she'd held in. He got up, put the cold coffee in the sink, and went to the window. Silver Ridge below him was quiet and lit in patches by the orange of the streetlights, the snow on the ground reflecting everything upward, so the night was lighter than it should have been. He could see 3 blocks in every direction, and the whole thing had the particular clarity of winter nights, the air too cold for softness. He picked up his phone. He opened the thread with Vivienne. He typed, "I want to see you, not for coffee. I want to actually talk." He sent it before he could revise it. Her response came in 6 minutes. "I know," she wrote. "I think I have more to tell you." He read that and understood that she'd gotten there too. That whatever circle she'd been making, she'd finally arrived at the thing in the center. He typed, "Tomorrow?" She wrote back, "Yes. The cafe on Terrace again?" "The cafe on Terrace," he confirmed. He set the phone down and looked out at the lit-up dark for another minute. She loved him first. He didn't know yet what to do with that, but he knew it was true, and he knew it mattered, and he knew that tomorrow she was going to say it out loud herself, in her own words, with the particular precision she used when she finally decided a thing was worth saying. He went to bed and slept better than he had in 3 weeks, which surprised him until he thought about it and realized it didn't surprise him at all. He finally knew what the shape of the thing was. That was always the part that let him sleep. He got to Ember 12 minutes early. This was unusual for him. Evan was a punctual man. Not early, not late. The kind of person who arrived at the exact time because arriving early felt like pressure, and arriving late felt like disrespect. And he'd calibrated himself somewhere in the middle as a matter of practical respect. But this morning, he'd left the apartment at 9:17, which meant he was sitting at the same table by the fireplace at 9:48, with his coffee ordered and his jacket over the back of the chair, and nothing to do but watch the door. The snow from the weekend had compacted overnight into the grayish-brown crust that Silver Ridge always got by mid-December, the picturesque part long gone and replaced by the functional reality of winter in a mountain town. The streets outside the cafe window were sanded and scraped and ordinary. A delivery truck idled at the curb. A woman walked past with two dogs who were conducting their own separate investigations of every vertical surface on the block. Evan wrapped his hands around his cup. He thought about what he'd overheard in the bookstore. He'd made a decision last night, lying in the dark after his phone conversation with Vivienne, that he wasn't going to use it. Not as an opening, not as leverage, not as the thing that forced the conversation in a direction she hadn't chosen herself. Whatever she was going to tell him today, she'd earned the right to tell it in her own order. He'd heard Lauren's version, which was accurate and given with the kind of frustrated love that sisters had for each other, but it wasn't Vivienne's version. And the version that mattered in this room, at this table, was hers. So he would listen. He was good at listening. The job had taught him that. The ability to hear what a system was doing before you touched it, to understand the complaint of a pipe, or a failing unit, or a building running wrong in weather it wasn't designed for. You listened first, you asked the right questions, you didn't assume you already knew what the problem was. He heard the door. Vivienne came in and he watched her clock the room the way she always did. The fast sweep, exits, layout, who was where. And then she saw him, and something in her posture changed, a small settling, the way a person landed when they found the thing they'd been looking for. She was in a dark wool coat and her hair was pulled back again today, the version of her that ran the company, and she walked to the counter and ordered before coming to the table, which was the kind of thing she did automatically, not allowing someone else to buy her coffee before she'd had a chance to make the decision herself. She sat down across from him. "You're early," she said. "You're exactly on time." "You're exactly on time." "I'm 30 seconds late." "I wasn't counting." She gave him a look that said she was fairly sure he had been, and she wasn't wrong, and they both left it there. Her coffee came. She wrapped her hands around it. The fireplace was going again, the same slow warmth as Saturday, the same light moving on the walls. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I told you most of it on Saturday. I want to tell you the rest." "Take your time." "I've had enough time," she said, with a flatness that wasn't quite self-deprecation, but was close to it. "I've had years." He nodded and waited. She looked at her coffee, then at the table, then at some middle point between the two. Not evasive, organizing, he recognized it now, the way she entered a complicated space. "The first time I saw you," she said, "wasn't at Lauren's family dinner." He kept his face still. "It was at the hardware store on Clement. I was picking up something for a property inspection. I do that sometimes, go in person. It keeps me honest about what things actually cost, and how they actually work. And you were 2 aisles over talking to one of the guys at the counter about a pipe fitting. I could hear you explaining the problem, not complaining, just describing it like a puzzle you were working through." She paused. "And then you turned around and Mia was right behind you. She couldn't have been more than 3, maybe 4, and she was holding a red rubber mallet that she'd apparently picked up off a shelf, and she looked at you very seriously and said something that made you laugh. And you took the mallet out of her hands and put it back without making a production of it, and then you explained to her why we don't take things off shelves in stores, and she listened." Vivienne stopped. She actually listened, like she trusted that you had a reason. Evan sat very still. He remembered that hardware run. He remembered the pipe fitting. He did not remember Mia having the mallet, but he remembered the store, the specific aisle, the particular afternoon quality of the light. Mia had been 3.5. "I mentioned you to Lauren that night," Vivienne said. "Not as anything, just, I said I'd seen this man at the hardware store with his daughter, and there was something about the way he handled it. She teased me about it. She said I noticed men who fix things because I spent my life around people who broke them." A small breath. 2 weeks later, she called me to say she'd met someone, and she described you, and I thought, okay, that's that. She paused. "And then she brought you to dinner." The fire shifted, settled. "I want you to understand what I did," Vivienne said, "because it wasn't just stepping back. Stepping back is a passive thing. It sounds passive. What I did was, I decided, actively. I made a decision that what I'd felt for those 2 weeks was a private thing that belonged to me and nobody else, and that Lauren's happiness was worth more than that. and I filed it away. She looked up at him. And I held it there for every dinner, every phone call, every time Lauren talked about you. I held it there when she was happy, and when things got complicated, and when you both decided to end it. And after, Evan said. And after, she confirmed. Because by then the habit was built. You were... She stopped. Tried again. You were a category I'd created, something I decided I didn't have access to. It's not rational, I know that. But I'd been so careful for so long that the carefulness became its own kind of wall, and I stopped questioning whether the wall was still necessary. He thought about her sitting alone at Caruso's, the second menu, the way she'd flipped her phone face down, the woman who ran a $3 billion company sitting in a restaurant being stood up by someone with a shrugging gif, and the particular loneliness of that, the specific quality of it, not just a canceled dinner, but the accumulated weight of someone who had gotten very good at not asking for the things she wanted. When you sat down, he said. When you sat down, she said, I thought, this is the person I decided I couldn't have, sitting across from me in a restaurant, making me laugh about an emoji, and he's going to eat bad takeout from a paper bag on a table that was set for two. She shook her head slightly. And I couldn't put it back in the drawer. I tried. That's what the slowdown message was. I tried to put it back and I couldn't find the drawer anymore. The room was quiet between them for a moment. Outside, the delivery truck had moved on. The street was ordinary in the December mid-morning. A woman with a stroller. A man walking fast with coffee in his hand. Can I tell you what I heard? Evan said. Vivienne went still. Not frightened. Alert. What do you mean? At the bookstore on Clement. Tuesday. He watched her face work through the information. The bookstore. Tuesday. And then something arrived in her expression, a careful reading, the kind she did when she was assembling pieces. Lauren, she said. I wasn't trying to listen. I was in the next aisle, and I heard your name, and then He stopped. I heard her say you liked me first, before she introduced us, before the dinner. Vivienne sat with that. The composure was there, the surface management, but underneath it something was moving in a way that was different from Saturday, less controlled, more immediate, like a person who has been holding a door shut for a long time and just felt the handle give. I was going to tell you, she said, quietly, without excuse. I know. I was working up to it. I know that too. She looked at him with the expression that he had come to understand was her most honest one, not the boardroom face, not the careful social composure, but the face she made when she didn't have time to prepare a version of herself and had to settle for the real one. A little raw, a little tired, sharper and softer at the same time. It changes things, she said, knowing that. Doesn't it? It explains things, he said. I'm not sure it changes them. It means I wasn't... She stopped, started over. At the restaurant, when you sat down. That wasn't a coincidence developing into something. That was something old that had been waiting for a coincidence. That's different. Is it worse? She looked at him. I don't know, she said. I thought it might be. I thought you might feel... She paused. Managed. Like something was arranged around you without your knowledge. Evan thought about that seriously. He gave it the respect it deserved as a concern, because it was a real concern, the kind that came from someone thinking carefully about someone else's experience rather than just defending their own. He thought about the January dinner and the hardware store before it, and the 5 months and the years after. He thought about all the family dinners where she'd sat at a table and listened and remembered and said nothing. You didn't arrange anything, he said. You sat at a table and kept your mouth shut for years. That's not managing somebody. That's just... He looked for the word. That's just being careful with something that mattered. Her breath came out slightly unsteady. I've been very careful, she said, for a very long time. I know. It gets exhausting, she said. And it wasn't a complaint. It was just the truth arriving without polish. The kind of thing that came out when you'd been saying the managed version long enough that the unmanaged version finally got tired of waiting. Yeah, he said. I imagine it does. They stayed in the quiet for a moment. The fire. The coffee getting cool. The December light through the window doing its flat gray work on the street outside. Then Evan said, Lauren. Vivienne looked at him. What about her? Does she know we're here today? No. A pause. But she knows we've been talking. She knows. Vivienne stopped. After the call where she guessed that I liked you, she called back the next day. She said she'd been thinking about it, and she wanted to be clear. Vivienne's voice changed slightly, became more careful. She said our relationship ended years ago, cleanly, for reasons that had nothing to do with her or me. She said she didn't have feelings that were being protected. She said, a breath. She said she wanted me to stop making her happiness the reason I didn't have any. Evan was quiet. That's a direct thing to say, he said. Lauren is direct when it matters. I'm the one who, she almost smiled without humor, who takes the long way. What did you say when she said that? I said I needed to think about it. Vivienne looked at him. And then I sent you the slow down text because I panicked, and then I went to Denver for 2 weeks and thought about it very carefully in a hotel room, and arrived at the conclusion that I had spent 30 years being the person who handles her own situation and doesn't inconvenience anybody, and that Lauren was telling me to stop, and that I didn't know how. And now? He said. She met his eyes. I'm trying, she said. This. Right now. This is me trying. He reached across the table, not reaching for her hand the way he had on Saturday. This time he put his hand on the table between them, open, palm up. A different thing. An offering rather than a reach. She looked at it. Then she put her hand in his. Her fingers were cold from the coffee cup, and she held on with the slightly excessive grip of someone who wasn't entirely sure the thing they were holding was going to stay. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. Mia. She said it carefully. I like her. I want you to know I'm not including her because she's part of the package. I actually like her. She's strange and very bright, and she asks questions that make me recalibrate my answers in real time. A pause. But she's also 8, and I don't have experience with... She stopped. I don't want to do it wrong. There's no right way, he said. That's not reassuring. No, but it's true. There's no script. You just show up and you're honest with her, and you don't pretend to be something you're not, because she'll know immediately. He paused. She already likes you. She told me the day you walked with us to get hot chocolate. She said you asked the right questions. Something in Vivienne's face opened up slightly, the way a window opened. Not dramatically, just enough to let the air change. I didn't know I was asking the right questions, she said. I was just asking what I actually wanted to know. That's what the right questions are, he said. She looked at their hands on the table. His thumb had moved, without any particular decision, to the side of her hand, and she hadn't pulled back. I'm not easy, she said. It came out blunt and a little bit rehearsed, like she'd practiced saying it and was delivering the less polished version. I want you to know that going in, I work too much. I have terrible boundaries between work and not work. I don't know how to slow down when a project is in crisis, and I don't always communicate that I'm in crisis mode until I'm already 3 days into it. She paused. I've had relationships that ended because the person felt like they were competing with the company. Which is a fair complaint. I don't know how to fix it. I've tried. Okay, he said. That's it? Okay? I fix heating systems for a living. I have an 8-year-old who thinks she's an engineer. I come home smelling like machine oil, and I don't own anything that requires dry cleaning. He looked at her. I'm not worried about competing with your company. You should be, at least a little bit. Probably, he agreed. But I've been alone for 4 years, and I've gotten pretty good at recognizing the things that actually matter versus the things that just look like problems. He paused. You matter. The other stuff we can work around. She looked at him for a long moment. You're very calm about this, she said. I'm not calm. I'm just... He thought about it. I've been doing the thing where I understand the problem before I act on it. I think I understand the problem now. And what's the problem? That you've spent years protecting everyone else's feelings at the expense of your own, and you're not entirely sure you know how to stop, and you're worried that wanting something for yourself is going to cost you something you can't afford to lose. He held her gaze. Does that cover it? She was quiet for a moment. That covers most of it, she said. What's the rest? She looked down at their hands, then back up. I'm afraid, she said. Not of you. Not of this specifically. I'm afraid that I'll be bad at it. That I've spent so long in the other mode, the careful, managed, nothing for myself mode, that I won't know how to be in this one, that I'll revert. She paused. That one day you'll realize you've signed up for someone who is very good at her job and very bad at being available, and you'll have made room for someone who can't fill it properly. The honesty of it landed in the room and stayed there. He thought about what to say and didn't find the perfect thing, and said the real thing instead. I don't need it to be perfect, he said. I need it to be actual. She looked at him. Actual, she repeated. Real, present, not performed. I've done the thing where you have a person around, but they're not actually there. And I've done 4 years of nobody. Neither of those worked. He paused. You're actual. Even when you're managing your face, you're actual underneath it. I can tell the difference. I've been telling the difference since Caruso's. Something in her eyes changed. Not tears. He didn't think she was the kind of person who cried easily, and if she did, it wouldn't be here. Not yet. But something shifted. The long-held thing loosening slightly, the way tension released not all at once but in stages. The first stage being the decision that you were going to let it. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay? She said it again, differently, firmer, like a conclusion being reached. I'm going to be bad at this sometimes. I'm going to disappear into work and forget to communicate and probably handle at least one future situation by sending an inadequate text message instead of having an actual conversation. Probably, he said, and you're going to fix things around me constantly, and it's going to make me feel like I should be doing more. You build entire buildings, and we're both going to be wrong sometimes. Sure. And Mia is going to have opinions, strong ones. And Lauren is going to need to be okay with this. Actually okay. Not just saying she is. She told you to stop making her happiness your reason not to have any, he said. I think she's okay. Vivienne stopped. She looked at him. Something that wasn't quite a smile was working in her expression, the complicated predecessor to one, the thing that had more history in it than a simple smile did. You remembered that exactly, she said. You said it clearly. She stopped. Started over. You pay attention. I was going to say the same thing about you, he said. Years ago, apparently. That got the smile. The real one. The surprised one. The one that didn't have time to be polished or positioned. The one that meant something had gotten through the composure and she hadn't caught it in time. She pressed her free hand briefly to her mouth the way she did, and when she lowered it, her eyes were brighter. You're going to bring that up a lot, aren't you? She said. Probably not, he said, but at least once more, yeah. She laughed. Not the full one, something smaller, something she kept mostly to herself. And then she looked at their hands still on the table between them, and she turned hers slightly so it was less like a thing being held and more like a thing holding back. They stayed at Ember for 2 hours. Not talking about the big things the whole time. That was done, mostly, or at least the first layer of it was done. And they both knew that there would be more layers later because there always were. Because people were not problems you solved once and filed away. But for a while they just talked the way they had at Caruso's, the easy, accidental conversation that had started all of this, the kind that went in directions. Neither of them planned and covered more ground in an hour than most people covered in a month of careful, managed interaction. He told her about the stove burner he'd finally fixed. She told him about the Telluride project, which had finally reached a resolution about the glass floor. The architect had agreed to a reinforced version with better safety rails, which Vivienne had framed, following Evan's suggestion, as an enhancement of the original vision rather than a compromise. It had worked. The architect had even taken partial credit for the modification. Told you, Evan said. You did, she said. I used your exact language. You're welcome. I'm not crediting you in the press release. I don't want to be in the press release. Good. Because you're not going to be. It was the most comfortable exchange they'd had in weeks, and they both felt it. The particular ease of two people who had just put down something heavy and discovered their hands were free again. Outside, the day had gotten slightly brighter, the cloud thinning just enough to let something that wasn't quite sunlight make an attempt on the street. Evan watched a kid on the sidewalk lose a glove, reach for it, miss, watch it blow 3 feet further, and then abandon dignity entirely by running after it with the focused determination of a person for whom this specific glove mattered enormously. He got it, eventually. Evan watched him stuff it back on his hand and keep walking. Walked. He dropped Vivienne at her car at 11:50. She had a call at noon that she hadn't canceled, which she'd mentioned at 10:30, and the fact that she hadn't canceled it struck him as important. Not because she should have, but because it meant this was real. This was her actual life, and she was integrating him into the actual life, rather than creating a separate compartment for him the way she created compartments for everything. She was 30 years old and she ran a company and she had a noon call and she hadn't reshuffled it, and that was fine. That was actual. She paused before getting into her car. "I'm going to call Lauren tonight," she said. "Okay." "I mean, really call her, not check in, actually tell her." "How do you think she'll react?" Vivienne thought about it. "She'll say something sharp, and then something true, and then she'll ask if I'm happy." A pause. "And I'm going to have to figure out what to say to that." "What are you going to say?" She looked at him for a moment, standing beside her car in the grayish mid-morning, with her breath making small clouds and the last of the snow crust on the ground around them going soft in the almost light. "Something honest," she said. "For once." He nodded. She got in the car. She had the door half closed, and then she stopped and looked back out at him. "Evan." "Yeah." "The hardware store," she said. "On Clement. When Mia had the rubber mallet." She looked at him steadily. "I knew then. I want you to know I knew then." He stood there. "I know," he said. She nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been a long time coming. Then she closed the door and drove away. He stood in the cold for a moment. He thought about a 3-year-old with a red rubber mallet and the particular certainty of not knowing you were being watched. He thought about years of careful management and the cost of it. He thought about a woman who had gotten very good at the controlled version of things and was now, as of approximately 90 minutes ago, committed to trying something different. He walked back to his truck. He had a supply order to place before 2. He had a report to file on the 4th floor unit. He had Mia to pick up at 3:15, and she was going to want to tell him about the 900-piece puzzle and whether or not her suspicions about it had been confirmed. He started the truck and let it warm up. His phone buzzed. He picked it up. A text from Vivienne. The puzzle comment. "Ask Mia about the puzzle. I want to know if it's as bad as I think it is." He stared at it. He typed back, "How do you know about the puzzle?" "Carol told me." "We've been talking." He read that twice. "When did you and Carol start talking?" he typed. "After the hot chocolate. She texted me to say Mia mentioned me. We've been texting for 3 weeks." He sat with that. His mother-in-law had been texting the woman he was seeing for 3 weeks. Mia had mentioned Vivienne to Carol. Carol had reached out. Vivienne had been talking to his daughter's grandmother for 3 weeks without mentioning it, not because she was hiding it, but because it had simply become a thing that happened. A natural connection that had formed in the margins while he and Vivienne were carefully navigating the larger terrain. He thought about the drawer, the years of putting things away. And then he thought about a woman texting an older woman about a 900-piece puzzle and the quiet, unremarkable ordinariness of that, the way it suggested something taking root in the soil of everyday things rather than in the dramatic declared moments. He typed back, "I don't know whether to be surprised or not." She wrote, "Me either, but she's funny. She told me about Claire." He went still. He read it again. "She told me about Claire. Not asked to. Not prompted." Carol had decided, in her own way and in her own time, that the woman his daughter mentioned and who texted her funny things about puzzles deserved to know about the person who was still very much the shape of this family, even now. His throat did a complicated thing. He typed back, "What did she say?" Vivienne's response took a moment. When it came, it was short. She said Claire would have liked me. She said she'd have asked too many questions and then apologized for it and then asked 3 more. A pause, and then, she said the apology was the part that would have made her like me. Evan sat in his truck in the parking lot with the engine running. Outside, the December sky was doing what it did, being gray and enormous and indifferent, and the town was going about its midweek ordinary business. And he was sitting here reading a text on his phone about something Carol had said to a woman he hadn't known 5 weeks ago, and it was the most unexpectedly necessary thing he'd read in a long time. He typed, "Carol doesn't give those away easily." Vivienne wrote back, "I know. She told me that too." He put the phone down. He looked at the street for a moment, then he picked the phone back up and typed, "Tonight. Call Lauren. And then call me after." A pause. Okay, she wrote. And Vivienne, yes? He thought about what to say. He thought about the January dinner and the hardware store in 5 months and years, and a table at Caruso's and the second water glass still full. He thought about she liked him first and what it cost to be that careful for that long, and what it meant to finally stop. He typed, "You're allowed to want things. I need you to know that." The response took a while, long enough that he'd started the truck and was pulling out of the parking lot when his phone buzzed on the seat. He stopped at the light and picked it up. "I'm working on it," she'd written. And then, a second later, "Thank you for being patient with the work." He set the phone down and drove. The light ahead turned green, and the street opened up, and Silver Ridge in December was cold and gray and entirely ordinary. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary, something had shifted into a shape that felt, for the first time in a long time, like it might actually hold. Vivienne called Lauren at 7:15 that evening. She'd been sitting at her kitchen counter for 40 minutes before she did it, which was the kind of delay she'd normally fill with work. Open the laptop, review the Telluride numbers, respond to the 3 emails from the Denver team that had been sitting in her inbox since noon. She'd opened the laptop. She'd looked at the emails. She'd closed the laptop and sat there with a glass of water she wasn't drinking and the phone face up on the counter in front of her. She was 30 years old. She ran a company with 3,000 employees. She had negotiated contracts with men who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making people feel small in rooms. And she'd held her ground without raising her voice, without showing the seams, without giving them anything they hadn't earned. She had sat across from city councils, zoning boards, hostile investors, and at least one architect who'd cried during a meeting about a glass floor, and she had handled all of it. She was nervous to call her sister. She picked up the phone and called before she could revise herself out of it. Lauren answered on the 3rd ring, which meant she wasn't in the middle of something but had let it ring twice on purpose, which was a thing Lauren did when she wanted to appear less available than she was. "Hey," Lauren said. "Hey." A pause. The kind that had information in it. "So," Lauren said. "So," Vivienne said. "You're calling," Lauren said, "which means something happened or you made a decision because you don't call to chat, you text to chat, and call when there's an agenda." "I don't have an agenda." "Vivienne, I'm calling to talk to you." "About Evan Calder." Vivienne pressed her lips together. "About Evan, and about us. About—" She stopped, reorganized. "I told him, most of it, and then he told me he overheard you at the bookstore on Clement." The silence on Lauren's end was slightly longer than the previous one. "The bookstore," Lauren said. "Tuesday. You and, I'm assuming, Petra." "Yes." A pause. "How much did he hear?" "Enough to understand that I liked him before you brought him home." Lauren was quiet. Then, "Okay. That's all you're going to say?" "What do you want me to say, Viv? I've been telling you for weeks to just talk to him, to stop protecting a situation that doesn't need protecting anymore." Her voice wasn't unkind, just direct. The Lauren mode that Vivienne sometimes loved and sometimes found exhausting. "Is he upset? About any of it?" "No, he's—" Vivienne paused, looked for the right word. "He's unusually reasonable. It's slightly alarming." "That's not alarming, that's just what reasonable looks like when you're not used to it." Vivienne sat with that. "I need to know if you're actually okay," she said. "Not the version of okay where you're managing your reaction because you think I need you to be okay. Actually okay." Lauren was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not a performed one. "Honestly?" she said. "Please. I'm a little—" A breath. "It's strange. Not bad strange. Just, you and I have been doing this thing for years where I could tell something was in the room and neither of us named it. And now it's named. And it's weird to have it named after all that time of it being unnamed." A pause. "But weird isn't the same as bad." "Lauren, I'm okay, Viv. I promise." Her voice softened at the edges. "I liked him. We were good to each other. And it ended the way good things sometimes end. Not because anything went wrong, but because we were honest enough to admit we weren't going the same direction." Another pause. "I don't have feelings left over that need protecting. I just have a sister who apparently has been in her own way for 3 years and wouldn't listen to me when I told her to get out of it." Vivienne exhaled. "I'm trying to get out of it," she said. I know. That's why you called. A beat. How do you feel? Vivienne thought about Ember, the fireplace, Evan's hand on the table, the way he'd said I need it to be actual without hesitation, without softening it into something easier to receive. Scared, she said. Of what specifically? Of being bad at it. Of being someone who's easier to admire from a distance than to actually be with. Lauren was quiet. You're not, she said finally. You're difficult. You're in your head too much and you work too many hours and you don't ask for help when you need it. But you're not. You're not someone who's better from a distance. You're just someone who needs people to be patient enough to get past the first wall. A pause. Most people give up at the wall. He sat down at a restaurant table instead. Vivienne looked at her kitchen counter. The water glass, still full, the laptop, closed, the quiet of the apartment. I know, she said. So stop being scared of things that haven't happened yet, Lauren said, and go figure out what's actually in front of you. They talked for another 20 minutes, about the Telluride project, about their mother's upcoming birthday, about a trip Lauren was planning in the spring. Normal things. The ordinary thread of two sisters who had been close for 30 years and would be close for 30 more. And the particular comfort of that, the way it survived complications and named things and long silences and managed emotions, because it was built from something more durable than any of those. When they hung up, Vivienne sat at the counter for a while longer. Then she picked up her phone and called Evan. He answered before the second ring. How'd it go? He said. She said I have too many walls and don't ask for help. She's not wrong. I know she's not wrong. A pause. She's okay. Actually okay. I figured she would be. You were very confident about that. She told you to stop making her happiness your reason not to have any, he said. People don't say things like that unless they mean them. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, Denver was doing its nighttime thing. The lights, the traffic, the particular density of a city after dark that Silver Ridge never quite reached. She had an apartment here for the week she needed to be close to the main office, but it had always felt more like a functional space than a place she lived. 4 rooms that she slept and worked in. A kitchen she used for coffee and not much else. Mia's asleep, she said. About an hour ago. She told me the puzzle is 400 pieces of a mountain range that all look identical, and she's beginning to feel Carol set her up. Vivienne laughed. She absolutely set her up. 100% intentional. Carol's funny. She really is. People underestimate her. A pause. She likes you. She told me about Claire, Vivienne said. I know. I've been thinking about that. Is it okay that she did? Yeah, he said, quietly but without hesitation. It's okay. She looked at the city lights through the window. Tell me something, she said. What? Tell me something ordinary. About today. Something that has nothing to do with... She gestured at the air, at all of it. Any of this. He was quiet for a second. The 4th floor unit is running better, he said. We replaced 2 components we'd been watching for a month, and Kenny said it was the most satisfying repair he'd done all year, which is a Kenny-specific thing to say, but he meant it. And you, she said. Was it satisfying? Yeah, he said. It was. A pause. It's a good feeling. When a system that's been struggling finally runs right, like something that had been working too hard gets to stop. She thought about that longer than he probably intended her to. Yeah, she said, I think I know what that feels like. The weeks that followed didn't arrange themselves into anything clean or cinematic. That was the thing nobody warned you about. Not the falling, not the deciding, but the after, which was just life happening in the ordinary way, except that there was another person in it now who was learning your rhythms and whose rhythms you were learning. And some of it was easier than you expected, and some of it was harder. And none of it looked the way you'd imagined when you were sitting in a cafe by a fireplace making what felt like enormous declarations. Vivienne drove up to Silver Ridge on a Saturday in late December, 2 weeks after Ember. Not a planned visit. She'd been in Telluride for the final walkthrough of the resort property, and Silver Ridge was on the way back, and she'd texted Evan from the road, I'm 40 minutes out. Is that too short notice? He'd written back, Mia's making pancakes. Get here before she burns the second batch. She got there. Mia had not burned the second batch, though the first had been a casualty, and she reported this with the comprehensive honesty of someone who believed in accurate record-keeping. The apartment smelled like batter and the cheap maple syrup that Mia preferred over the better bottle Evan kept on the upper shelf, and there was flour on the counter and a dish towel on the floor, and the kitchen was not in the condition of a place that had been prepared for a guest. Vivienne sat on a stool at the counter and ate pancakes and felt the strangeness of it. The comfortable, disorienting strangeness of being in a space that had been a life before she arrived, a real and settled life with its own textures and habits and inside references, and finding that it made room for her without rearranging itself. "These are good," she told Mia. "I know," Mia said, with zero modesty. "I figured out the ratio. Dad's been doing it wrong." "I've been doing it the recipe's way," Evan said. "The recipe's wrong," Mia said. Vivienne looked at Evan. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had accepted certain truths about his household and found peace in that acceptance. "She's right," Vivienne said. "These are better than any pancake recipe I've seen." Mia pointed at her with the spatula. "See?" "Don't point with the spatula," Evan said. Mia lowered the spatula, satisfied. It was a small moment, the kind that didn't announce itself, didn't carry obvious significance. Flour on the counter and cheap syrup and an 8-year-old being insufferably correct about pancake ratios. But Vivienne sat there on the stool and felt something she didn't have a word for, something that was somewhere between comfort and recognition, the sensation of a space that fit in a way you hadn't known you were looking for. She stayed until 2. They walked, the three of them, along the path by the reservoir, the same one Evan had mentioned on their first night at Caruso's, the one she'd already known about because she'd heard him describe it to Lauren years before. The snow was deep on either side of the cleared path, and Mia walked ahead of them at the particular pace of a child who was simultaneously exploring and narrating, reporting back on the ice thickness at the reservoir's edge, the evidence of animal tracks, the structural integrity of a snow formation she'd decided was architecturally significant. "She's going to be an engineer," Vivienne said quietly, not for Mia to hear. "She's going to be whatever she decides," Evan said. "But yeah, probably something with buildings. Good genes." He looked at her sideways. "From her mother, mostly." Vivienne nodded. She didn't ask more because she'd heard what she needed to hear from Carol, and she understood that Claire was a presence in this family, the way the mountains were a presence in this town. Not gone, not diminished, just the permanent landscape that everything else was built into. "She would have liked the pancake thing," Evan said after a moment. "She had opinions about ratios, too." "It runs in something," Vivienne said. He almost smiled. "Yeah, it does." Ahead of them, Mia had stopped to examine a set of tracks in the snow with the focused attention of a detective, crouching down with her hands on her knees, her hat slightly sideways. She looked back over her shoulder. "Fox," she announced. "Definitely fox." "Could be a large cat," Evan said. "It's a fox," Mia said, with finality. Vivienne caught Evan's eye. He shrugged. She shrugged back. "I believe her," Vivienne said. "Traitor," he said. "You were the one who taught her to be confident in her conclusions." "I taught her to check her work first. She checked the tracks. She looked at them for 4 seconds. She's efficient." He laughed. A real one, surprised out of him, the kind she was still learning the specific frequency of. She filed it away without meaning to, the way she filed away everything about him, the same way she always had, except that now there was no drawer to put it in. Now it just stayed. January arrived in Silver Ridge the way it always did, with cold that stopped being interesting and became purely structural, the kind that determined what you wore and how long you stayed outside, and whether the building systems were going to hold through the week. Evan spent the first 2 weeks of January fighting 3 separate heating failures across the municipal complex, working 12-hour days with Kenny and the new hire, who was still learning which problems you fixed by reading the manual and which ones you fixed by listening to what the building was telling you. Vivienne was in Denver for most of it, in the final push of a refinancing deal that had been running since October, and required the kind of focused, sustained attention that left very little margin for anything else. They texted. Some days a lot, some days a brief check-in, and there were 2 days where Evan was on site until 10, and she was in meetings until 11, and they exchanged exactly 4 messages, one of which was a picture Mia had sent Vivienne directly of the Fox tracks from December, labeled in Mia's handwriting, "Confirmed Fox." "I was right." Vivienne had sent it to Evan with the caption, "In case you had lingering doubts." He'd sent back a single thumbs up, which she was beginning to understand was his version of conceding a point gracefully. She called him on a Thursday night, the first week of January, from her Denver apartment at 9:30, which was late enough that she wasn't sure he'd be awake. He answered immediately. "You're still up," she said. "Heating report. I could do these in my sleep, but I can't do them asleep. There's a difference." "How's the third floor unit?" "Holding. Probably buying us 2 more weeks before we need to replace the compressor." "And the fourth?" "Good. Running clean." Pause. "How's the deal?" "Close. 2 more days, maybe 3. "You sound tired." "I am tired." She said it plainly, without apology. This was the thing she was practicing, saying the real state of things instead of the managed version. It was harder than it sounded. "I've been in the building since 7 this morning. Are you eating?" "I had lunch." "Vivienne, I had a very good lunch." "That's not what I asked." She smiled at her empty kitchen. "I'll get something, I promise." "There's a place on 16th that does soup until midnight. Kenny's sister works there. She says it's good." "You looked up late-night soup options in Denver for me." Kenny mentioned it. I remembered. She sat with that for a moment. The smallness of it and the weight of it simultaneously. The way certain things carried more than their size suggested. He'd heard a piece of information that was useful to her, and he'd kept it without making a production of keeping it, without announcing it. Just filed it away for when it mattered. She thought about all the things she'd filed away about him, over years, without anywhere to put them. She thought about how it felt to finally have somewhere to put them. "Evan," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you turned around, at Caruso's. I know I said it before. I'm saying it again." He was quiet for a second. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it because I want you to know I'm not just—" She stopped. "I'm not managing this, the way I manage things. I'm not performing a version of it that's easier to receive. I'm actually—" She stopped again. "Vivienne," he said. "Yeah." "I know," he said again, more quietly. "I can tell the difference, remember?" She exhaled. "Right," she said. "You can. Go get soup. I will. And call me tomorrow." "I will." A pause. "Evan?" "Thank you for being patient with the work." She'd said it before in a text, but she wanted to say it in her actual voice. "I know it's a lot, the hours, the disappearing. I'm working on that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. That was true in November, and it's still true. She nodded, which he couldn't see, and said goodnight, and sat alone in her Denver kitchen for a while after, listening to the city and thinking about Silver Ridge, and an apartment that smelled like pancakes, and a path by a reservoir, and a child who was probably right about the fox. The refinancing closed on a Friday in late January. Vivienne drove to Silver Ridge that evening without planning to. She was 2 hours from Denver, and her first instinct was the apartment, the quiet, the closed laptop. And then she thought about what Lauren had said. Stop being scared of things that haven't happened yet, and go figure out what's actually in front of you. And she drove north instead of south and texted Evan from the highway. "Deal closed. I'm driving up. Is that okay?" He wrote back in under a minute. "Mia wants to know if you're staying for pizza." "Does Mia get a vote?" "Mia always gets a vote. She's already campaigning." Vivienne drove to Silver Ridge. The pizza was the kind from the place on Main that Mia had strong opinions about, and they ate it on the living room floor because Mia had decided they were having a picnic, and somewhere between the second slice and the argument about whether pineapple was a legitimate pizza topic, Vivienne said yes, Evan said it was a philosophical question, not a pizza question. Mia said she didn't care either way, but found the debate interesting. Vivienne looked up and realized she was on the floor of an apartment eating cold pizza with flour still somewhere in the counter, grout from 3 weeks ago, and she was completely, entirely at ease. Not performed ease, not the ease she manufactured in boardrooms and at galas, the professional comfort that was its own kind of armor. Just ease. The real kind. The kind you didn't know you were missing until you were inside it. She stayed that night. Not in the way that needed explaining to Mia. Evan had a spare room, the one with the recaulked window he'd done in November, and she woke up on Saturday morning to the sound of Mia in the kitchen and the smell of coffee and the particular quality of morning light in Silver Ridge that was different from Denver, cleaner somehow, the mountains doing something to the air that no city could replicate. She lay still for a moment and listened. Mia was talking, not to Evan. On the phone, she realized, the quick cadence of a child relaying information with great urgency. She caught Carol's name. She caught the word pancakes, followed by a debate about whether Vivienne would be there for pancakes, and then Mia's voice dropped slightly, which meant she'd decided she was delivering confidential information. Vivienne smiled at the ceiling. She got up, found her sweater, and went to the kitchen doorway. Mia was at the counter with the phone tucked between her ear and her shoulder in a posture that was completely identical to the one Evan used when he was trying to do two things at once. She was watching the coffee maker with the focused attention of someone supervising a process she'd been warned not to interfere with but was finding it difficult not to. She saw Vivienne, and her face did three things in fast succession: surprise, calculation, and then the verdict. "She's up," Mia said into the phone. "Yeah, okay, I'll ask." She lowered the phone. "Grandma Carol wants to know if you want to come for Sunday dinner tomorrow. She's making the thing with the chicken." "What thing with the chicken?" Vivienne said. "The good one." Mia said it with the confidence of someone who considered this sufficient description. "It has the sauce." "I'd like that," Vivienne said. "Tell her yes." Mia raised the phone back to her ear. She said yes. A pause. "I know. I told you." Another pause, and then Mia laughed at something Carol said. A full, uncomplicated laugh. And Vivienne stood in the kitchen doorway of Evan Calder's apartment on a Saturday morning in January watching his daughter laugh with his late wife's mother, and felt the particular complexity of belonging to a thing that had history in it you hadn't been part of making. It wasn't simple. She wasn't going to pretend it was simple, because it wasn't and it wouldn't be, and anyone who told you that love was simple either hadn't been in it long enough or hadn't been paying attention. There was Claire's absence, which was a presence, which was always going to be a presence. And there was Mia, who was 8 and would be 9, and then 15, and then 22. And all of those versions of Mia would need something different, and Vivienne didn't know yet whether she'd be able to give the right things at the right times. There was Lauren, who was okay, actually okay, but for whom this was still strange, and there was a company that took more than it should, and there was a woman who had spent 30 years building walls and was now, imperfectly and slowly, learning to leave doors in them. It wasn't simple, but simple had never been what she was looking for. She'd had simple. She'd had managed and controlled and perfectly contained, and what it had given her was a series of empty chairs. Evan came in from the hallway, his hair not entirely organized, carrying his own coffee cup, and looking like someone who had been awake for 20 minutes and was still negotiating the terms of the morning. He stopped when he saw her. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. He looked at Mia on the phone, then back at Vivienne. "Carol?" "Sunday dinner." I said yes. She makes the thing with the chicken. That's what I heard. He came and stood beside her in the kitchen doorway. They stood there together watching Mia, who had moved on from the dinner arrangements and was now describing to Carol in comprehensive detail the structural weaknesses she'd identified in the 900-piece puzzle, which apparently Carol had solved 2 days after giving it to Mia, and this was a betrayal that required full reporting. Evan's arm was warm where it was close to hers. Not touching, exactly, just present, the specific proximity of a person who didn't need to announce themselves. "She called Carol first thing," he said quietly. "I noticed." "She does that. When something feels settled, she tells Carol." He paused. "It's what she does when things are okay." Vivienne looked at Mia at the counter, the phone tucked between her ear and her shoulder, the coffee maker behind her doing its slow work. "Things are okay," Vivienne said. "Yeah," Evan said. "They are." Well, in February, they went back to Caruso's. Not deliberately, not as a statement. Evan had mentioned the linguine the week before in the context of explaining to Mia why not all linguine was equal, which had somehow become a Saturday evening plan. And it was only when they pulled into the parking lot that Vivienne looked at the restaurant and then at Evan, and he looked back at her, and they both understood what they'd done without trying. "Same place," she said. "I didn't plan that." "I know." They went in. The Friday crowd was the same, loud and warm and glad the week was over. The hostess found them a table, not the same one, a bigger one near the back with enough room for Mia to spread her jacket and her book and the small notebook she carried everywhere, which she did immediately and without apology. Evan ordered the linguine. Vivienne ordered the salmon, which had been her original plan in October before she'd ended up eating cold takeout from paper containers at a candlelit table with a man she'd spent years not allowing herself to want. She looked at the room. She looked at the table near the window with the better candlelight. A couple sat there tonight, older, comfortable with each other, the kind of comfort that came from years of practice. They weren't talking much. They didn't need to. The woman said something and the man laughed and the woman looked pleased with herself, and they went back to their food. Vivienne thought about October, the second menu, the untouched water glass, the particular loneliness of sitting in a crowded room with an empty chair across from you and trying very hard to look like it wasn't what it was. She thought about the moment she'd heard the door and looked up, and there was a man with a takeout bag and flour on his jacket. No, that wasn't right. There was no flour that night. She was mixing up her images, which meant he'd gotten into her like a habit, the way familiar things got, the way you stopped seeing them clearly and started just knowing them. Mia was reading her book with one hand and eating bread with the other, and Evan was watching the room with the particular attentiveness of a maintenance man who never entirely stopped listening to buildings. And Vivienne sat across from both of them and understood something she hadn't had the words for until right now. She hadn't been waiting for a person. She'd been waiting to stop running from herself, from the part of herself that wanted something and kept being told by the careful, managed, wall-building part that the wanting was inconvenient, that it cost too much, that there were other people's feelings to consider, other arrangements to protect, other reasons to keep everything in its drawer. The wanting had been there since a hardware store on Clement Street, since a man had taken a rubber mallet from a 3-year-old's hands and explained patiently and without drama why we don't take things from shelves. Since she'd gone home that night and mentioned him to Lauren, and Lauren had said she'd met someone, and Vivienne had put it in the drawer and turned the key. The drawer was open now. It had been open since October, since a man in work boots had looked back through a restaurant door at a woman who was pretending she wasn't hurt, and turned around and sat down and said exactly the right thing without knowing it was the right thing. "You're doing the face." She thought about all the things she'd learned about love in 30 years, from watching her parents, from her own failed attempts at it, from the careful managed distance she'd kept from it for most of her adult life. And the truest thing she'd arrived at was this: it didn't announce itself cleanly. It didn't come with clear terms and reasonable timelines and enough information to make an informed decision. It came in the form of a man noticing you from across a restaurant when you were in the middle of being embarrassed. And it came in the form of an 8-year-old who pointed at you with a spatula and was immediately told not to point with the spatula. And it came in the form of a sister who told you to stop protecting arrangements that no longer needed protecting. And it came in the form of a mother-in-law who texted you about puzzles and told you things about a woman she'd loved that were not hers to hold alone anymore. It came in ordinary forms, in flour on a counter, and cold pizza on a living room floor, and a spare room with a recocked window, and a coffee maker that took longer than it should, and a child who filed weather reports with her grandmother as a method of telling the people she loved that things were okay. The food came. Mia put her book down with the careful deliberateness of someone setting aside something valuable. They ate. Evan told a story about the 4th-floor unit that was more technical than it needed to be, and that Mia interrupted twice with questions that were somehow both irrelevant and exactly on point. Vivienne ate her salmon and listened and added a question about the compressor that made Kenny's assessment out of a memory of a conversation in early January. Evan looked at her. "You remembered that," he said. "I remember things," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled. Not the small one, the real one. The one that took over his whole face when it arrived and that she was only beginning to understand was rare, was the one he didn't give to everybody. "Yeah," he said. "You do." Mia looked between them with the expression of someone who had processed the available data and arrived at a conclusion she was content to keep to herself. She picked up her bread. She ate it. She went back to her book. Outside, Silver Ridge was doing what it always did in February, being cold and real and indifferent to anyone's story. The mountains going dark at the edges, the streets salted and lit, the ordinary machinery of a town at night going about its business. Inside, the restaurant was warm and loud. At the table near the back, an 8-year-old was reading a book. A man was eating linguine. A woman was eating salmon and sitting in a room where, 4 months ago, she'd been sitting alone at a table for two with an empty chair across from her and a phone she'd flipped face down because she didn't want to look at what was on the screen. The chair was not empty now. It would not be empty tonight or tomorrow or the Sunday dinner at Carol's or the Thursday mornings that were a standing thing even though nobody had called them that, or the coming spring when the snow would finally give and the trail by the reservoir would clear enough to walk without the cold making it a commitment. There was no guarantee beyond what was actually in front of them. That was the truth of it. The unglamorous, unromanticized truth that nobody framed and put on a wall, but that mattered more than the things people did frame and put on walls. There were no guarantees. There was just the decision, made and remade, to keep showing up to the thing you'd decided was worth showing up for, to keep turning around when you were halfway through the door, to take the empty chair. Vivienne had spent years learning all the sophisticated ways to protect herself from wanting things she might not get. She'd gotten very good at it. She'd built an empire, in part, out of that discipline. So the ability to defer, to contain, to manage the distance between what she felt and what she allowed herself to act on. She was still learning to unlearn it. Some days were better than others. Some days the old habits came back, the pulling back, the overwork, the retreat into the professional mode when the personal one felt too exposed. Some days she caught herself composing the managed version of something and had to stop and find the real version, which was always less polished and more accurate. But she was learning, and there was a man across the table who was patient with the work. Not because he didn't notice when she reverted. He noticed. He was very good at noticing. It was the job, it was him, it was the particular attentiveness of someone who had spent years listening to things running wrong beneath surfaces that looked fine. He noticed. He just didn't make her feel worse for it than she already did. He let her work it out. And then, when she'd worked it out, he was still there. That was the thing she hadn't known to look for. Not someone who didn't see the walls. Someone who saw them and waited, not impatiently, not with the particular resentment of someone keeping score, but with the straightforward steadiness of a man who had decided she was worth the wait and had meant it when he said it and kept on meaning it when it was tested. She had spent years giving that to other people, stepping back, holding doors, making space. She had been so practiced at the giving that the receiving had become almost foreign. The vulnerability of being on the other side of someone's patience, someone's attention, someone's decision to stay. She was learning that too. Mia put her book down again, apparently having reached a satisfactory stopping point, and looked at both of them with the comprehensive evaluation she deployed when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. "We should come here more," she said. "We just got here," Evan said. "I know, but we should come here more. It's good." She looked at the bread. "The bread is good." "The bread is very good," Vivienne agreed. Mia nodded with satisfaction, like a point had been settled. She pulled her notebook toward her and started drawing something. A floor plan, Vivienne saw, the careful labeled rooms, the little notations. Mia's office, no Dad's, had a new addition at the bottom. A second room, this one with a window symbol she'd drawn carefully on the wall, labeled in Mia's handwriting, V's room, window faces right direction. Vivienne looked at it. Then she looked at Evan, who had also seen it, and who was looking at his daughter with the expression he got when something had caught him off guard in a way he hadn't prepared for. He cleared his throat. "The window faces what direction?" he said. "East," Mia said, without looking up. "She likes morning light, I checked." Evan looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked at Evan. "She checked," Vivienne said. "She checks everything," he said. Outside, February was doing its February things. Inside, the restaurant was warm. The bread was good. An 8-year-old with a notebook was designing a building that had rooms for everyone she loved, and she'd checked which direction the windows faced, because that was the kind of thing that mattered if you were doing it right. The chair across the table was not empty. It had not been empty for 4 months. And the woman sitting in it had finally, at 30 years old, after years of careful managed distance and packed away feelings, and a very good memory put to uses it was never meant for, finally understood what it felt like to stop running from the thing you'd always wanted. It felt like morning light through a window that faced the right direction. It felt like bread that someone had told you was good and turned out to be exactly that. It felt like an ordinary Friday evening in a restaurant in a mountain town, with the people who had become, without announcement or ceremony, the shape of your life. It felt like coming home to a place you'd never lived. But somehow, in the particular way that only the true